doing business in the US, with the US, and fun things along the way. My name is Brett Parry. I'm the cultural mentor, and I live here. I'm Australian. I live here in the US, have done for 20 years, and I have done a lot of business in this country, this wonderful country. And I live in Chicago, right in the smack bang in the middle of it. And what we do is we teach culture, we investigate culture, we dig into culture, and we try and work out what's going on underneath the surface to try and make it more successful for people to do business in different parts of the world. And to steal a catchphrase from my Australian, a very popular Australian sporting commentary duo, they say too much sport is never enough, and too much culture is never enough. So we like to talk about that as well. And right now, of course, none of this would be possible without my good friend and colleague and the guy that drinks beer with coffee, Christian Höferle, who is the culture, the culture guy and runs the Culture Mastery. How are you today, pal?
Al, well, good day, mate. I am doing fabulous. And yes, I once drank beer with coffee, and we will tell you how that came about after maybe yet another beer that we will drink together. But this is not the forum to divulge my deepest secrets here.
We're leaving snippets. It's like people, to get people intrigued.
Yeah, we're opening loops that we will sometimes maybe close. There, we're putting little pieces on the trail. Welcome everybody to Doing Business with the United States on this beautiful June day. At least it's beautiful where I live. I am German by birth, American by choice, and I live in the beautiful city of Atlanta, smack dab in the heart of it, as Brett would say. And it is a wonderful place to be, because it is a city unlike most other big cities in the US, where the levels of diversity and how they play out in Atlanta, greater Atlanta society, are a bit different. The dynamics are a bit different than they are in other parts of the country. And we're not doing this webinar in a vacuum. Brett and I are painfully aware of what's going on in this country right now. And we are also aware how the world is viewing this country and observing the United States at this current moment. So please know that this is not going to be a political platform, or we're not going to take sides in either way or make this about something that it is not. However, we also acknowledge that we cannot ignore that topic, and you will notice how we, from the get-go, when we planned this webinar and our presentation, we always had that piece of US culture in mind as well. So this is not something we are doing now because of what's going on in the country. This is because it's been like this in this country for a long time. And if you're doing business with the United States, you may need to be aware of how inequality and different levels of justice or injustice or economic ability and access to resources are unevenly distributed, and how that affects the country and how that affects the culture and the fabric of this country, and maybe how it at some point maybe was a little bit built into the fabric of this country. And we're experiencing now a time where, who knows, there might be some readjustment, open end, as we will discuss later on. Right, Brett?
Absolutely. People are listing here where they're from. There's people from Canada, the US. We've got Germany. We've got India. We've got let me see, all over the place. And somebody said they're not far from the pictures behind me, which is the wonderful St Andrews. Not that I'm a golfer, but let's get that out of the way. I'm not a golfer by any stretch of the imagination. My friends call it comedy, not golf. But I like the pictures; they're nice. And so thank you. Yes, everybody. Yes, that's exactly what we do, and we love what we do. This is a fascinating field. I mean, you get up every day, you get jazzed because you get to find out about the intricacies, both the good and bad, of what we do, and where we do it, and what we look at. So yeah, it's great fun.
It is great fun, and it is also challenging at times, because our work is, well, part of our work is explaining or moderating how cultures show up and how they can show up in a form or in a format or in a phase that may not be appealing to everybody. And we're not cultural relativists, and we're not trying to negotiate away what could be perceived as a positive or a negative aspect of certain cultures. May I remind you that all cultures of the world have their strong sides and other sides that are challenging for some to experience. I do not want to bring up the word, well, I am bringing up the word culture shock. But not everything that we experience as we enter foreign cultures is necessarily a shock. It may be varying degrees of discomfort, and this is mainly the work that Brett and I do. We allow to see people their potential. We show them the tools to navigate discomfort and change, because that's what it is. If you're doing business with another culture, you may want to become comfortable with difference. You may want to become comfortable with the discomfort that you feel once in a while. And that's a psychological exercise, and that is something that developed individuals can handle. And there might be times when you feel alienated. There might be times when you feel not understood or not belonging, and that is part of the process. And our work is helping our clients to work through some of that, right, Brett?
Absolutely. And as in the next couple of slides, even though we know there's a lot of people on here that have kind of studied culture, some of them do our work, are wonderful colleagues that we've learned from. A lot of the things that we do is about questioning our assumptions and our perceptions. And we do that even as cultural professionals. You know, we have to do that. That's really at the core of why we do it, so that we know that we don't have all the answers. We have basically observations, and we test those observations, and we study them, and we learn. And I've always said it's really given me personally a freedom, an absolute freedom to now understand better and learn from better the people that are not like me.
And also know that given the topic, given the culture that we chose to put a lens on today, we also know that there might be some questions that will lead us down some rabbit holes. We encourage you to be active in the chat box. So again, we're aware that this isn't happening in a vacuum. Also, please know that we will only address civil comments, and we will not engage with mudslinging or accusations or blatant sweeping generalizations. However, we do understand that this might lead us down a certain path, led by your questions, and it may lead us a little bit over time. So we discussed this will be a 1-hour webinar, and if we go over, so be it. The recording is running, and if you have to jump off at the hour, we totally get it. Rest assured, you will get a copy of, no, not a copy, but you will get access to the recording of this webinar. We'll post it on YouTube in a unlisted link, so only those of you who registered will have access to that.
All right. Well, I just will say, as you are engaging in the chat, just kind of do a little bit of a check down the bottom. There is an option, pull down option, to say you are commenting with panelists and attendees. So if it just says panelists, that only gets to us. We want people to interact, and we want people to share experiences, and so that everybody can see and we can have an open dialogue. So that's just a little reminder. I always forget that bit because I'm forgetful.
Excellent. And let's keep the participant list open as well, so we have an eye on everything. That's why you want to have 2 people on a webinar, so we can have each other's back. All right. So doing business with the US is a fun experience, as this image I hope will elicit in you. That's one of the reasons why I am in this country, and I think it's one of the reasons why Brett is in this country. Doing business with the United States is a rewarding experience, albeit not always easy. However, there is as we say, there is ROI, there is a return on your investment, whether it be monetary or emotionally, whatever your investment may be. There, I have seen great returns in the time, in those 17 plus years that I've lived in this country. And today we're going to look at the main cultural values, or some of the main cultural values of the US. There are so many that we won't be able to cover them in the full hour. And we will learn how to understand that these values impact how we communicate, how we build relationships and trust, how we work with each other, and how we lead, or how we instruct, inspire, and motivate people that we engage with. We'll also look at how we can develop an understanding of the cultural dynamics. How does this play out in business, and how does this play out in the behaviors that we experience with people from the US? And we'll show you a few tools and strategies how you can improve your business with the US. And a quick caution on the terminology that I prefer to use. And I know there's a lot of people here that either live in the United States or are actually from the US. I try to say US Americans. Once in a while, I will forget to say US Americans and use the term American synonymously. And I am aware that is incorrect. The American continents, North and South, are big, and there are many countries, and the US is not the only one. So just for clarification's sake, should you feel weirded out by the fact that I keep saying US Americans, then it is because my friends from Mexico and Argentina and Brazil and Ecuador are also Americans, and I want to make sure that we get the distinction straight.
One thing I didn't say, Christian, at the outset, and we probably forget this more often than we do, is to obviously acknowledge the First Peoples of the First Nation peoples of this country, upon which land and treasured and storied land we stand and do business. So I think that is a good reminder of a lot of our good friends in that community, that they teach us that we do that, and we do honor that. So just want to put that out. And that's
Yes.
the same for any country, of course.
Yes, and I think this was one of my first uncomfortable experiences when I first came to the United States. I was an exchange student at the tender age of 17, and I came to go to senior high school in northwestern Minnesota. Yeah, you betcha. Some of you have heard the story before. If you watch the movie Fargo, which I encourage you to do, it's a very entertaining film by the Coen brothers, then you will get a clear idea of where I spent the year 1988 as a high school exchange student. And the uncomfortable experience was not that movie. The uncomfortable experience was when my host family took me to the reservation, White Earth Reservation in Mahnomen County in northwestern Minnesota, and seeing how the First Nations, how the native population of this continent is living today. That was a strong wake-up moment for me as a teenager. So yes, respect and honor to those who've been inhabiting this land for thousands of years. As you approach any foreign culture, as you do business with anybody that does not share your values 100%, or that was not raised the way you were, you should be aware of the fact that you're entering an area of business, or an enter of behavioral disconnect that you may sometimes expect, sometimes you won't. And the challenge with the United States is that a lot of people around the world think they know and understand the United States, because the United States has been very successful for about 100 years, especially in their media production, so film, movies, TV shows, theater productions, musicals, music, entertainment, literature, pop culture in general in the 20th century and going on in the 21st century has been hugely successful around the world, coming from the United States, and has created the assumption of knowledge about this country as as I had this assumption coming to this country for the first time. I thought I knew the Americans, the US Americans. And then when I came here, I recognized not all my assumptions were true. So as we enter foreign lands of which we anticipate to have a large or a big behavioral gap, we go in there with a higher level of awareness and alertness. That is not always the case with people from around the world entering the United States, because they come here often thinking, yeah, this should be a walk in the park. This can't be that hard. I already have a decent understanding of the people of this land. So let me remind you, it is just as tricky as is the biggest cultural difference that you can imagine with any other country compared to yours. The US are not a cakewalk. The US are actually a land with I hate to use a military term, but it's there's landmines there, there's tripwires, and you want to be aware of those and how you navigate through those. Because chances are, when we look at other cultures, it is not the other culture that we see at its face value. We see it through our own lenses. As Anais Nin said, we see it through we see the world as we are. It's our perception that forms our image of the world, our map of the territory, and our views are limited because we distort, delete, and generalize all the information that we consume to form our map of the world. And our map of the world, if we're not from the US, may be different than the people that live inside this country. And even inside a country like the US, a huge landmass with 300 and hard to say right now, maybe 340 million people. As we will walk you through here, there are regional and subcultural differences where people within this same nation don't always understand each other right away. Why is this important? Why does culture matter? Because if you don't get culture, it says right here, if you don't get culture, culture will eventually get you. We're seeing this right now in the United States, where people do not understand each other. Culture is getting the US people right now, because a lot of different subcultures in the US do not understand each other well. So I don't have to read this slide to you. This is why I am convinced culture is everything. Without understanding of culture, without understanding each other's value and what drives our behaviors, we will not resolve any issue. I see a lot of comments come in, and Brett, I hope you kept tabs on them, because as I was talking, I did not read them. Anything we need to address right now?
Well, I'd love to, because there's some great comments and good reminders for us. I mean, we obviously, Alan said that, we'd be careful about using the "we're all immigrants" type of vernacular to describe the US, because that does tend to diminish the experience of the Native Americans and the people that came here without choice, the slaves that came here without choice. So that is a good point. And then the wonderful thing, Marshall said, even Americans don't always know ourselves. Edward T. Hall, the father of intercultural work, said that culture hides more than what it reveals, and strangely enough, what it hides from its own participants. So that's a great statement, just to demonstrate that fact, is that we often, I don't know, I've learned a lot about my country now sitting on the porch and looking back in at it. That's been a very big lesson. And to our just a little insider thing, but not too much inside. Alan did say that the United States is grammatically singular, and Christian asked me about this the other day. But we were, and I always thought it of singular. But because, maybe linguistically or language driven, some people might look at the United States with an S on it and think of it as a plural, but it is in a collection of states. We'll address that anyway.
I'm a perpetual learner, and I'm open to input to improve myself. And Alan Hetblum has been...
This is mein Bruder. Mein Bruder. I don't know
he's my brother. And since we're talking about siblings, I want to acknowledge one attendee here from Minneapolis. Actually, she's dialing in from Minnesota, Adriana Haugen Rodriguez Gil. Shout out to Minnesota, to Adriana, whose brother down in Mexico is recovering from a health scare. So talked to your brother yesterday, Adriana, and I'm happy to see that he's better. All right, moving on. So what do we know? What do we not know about each other? I think this slide could go into any type of learning environment. There is uh, this human flaw that we think we have peeked into something new and that we have gathered enough information about something, and now we know. And then as we know, we also become aware of what we don't know yet, so we keep exploring. This is what humankind has been doing since it discovered that there is things that need learning. What we sometimes tend to forget is that there is a large part of the knowledge that we don't have yet, and that we're not even aware that it's there, so our blind spots. And as I said, I'm a perpetual learner. I'm immersing myself with people who help me see my blind spots and uncover some of those. And in return, I feel it's my responsibility as a teacher, as a trainer, as a facilitator, to help others see their potential and remove some of their blind spots. And that's what we're going to do here. We're not going to smart ass you. We're just going to shine some light on things that you may not be aware yet. And we think it might be a good idea to become aware of it. And you have a choice whether you want to engage or not. So
I'm an Aussie. I get the smart ass. I'm an Aussie. It's in my culture.
yeah, well, you guys do, but I exclude you. So let's hear it from you. I want to hear from the participants. We have 74 attendees at the moment. This may be a new personal best here. But hey, as you know, as you will learn later on in this country, in this culture, winning is a value, right? So I want to hear from you. What are your biggest, or what have been some of the biggest challenges you've had when working with people in the US or from the US? Have you worked with US Americans? How comfortable are you with them? And what is it you want to learn? What is it that, what knowledge gap can we help you fill today? Type it in the comment box, and you may think of it later on. You may not think of it right now. Type it in the chat box. We will record that as well. And the answers that we won't be able to provide during this webinar, Brett and I will make sure to address in our follow-up with you. So feel free to ask those questions or to give us your input. Brett, am I missing anything? There is somebody in the QA box. Yep. Okay. All right.
There is too. Cornelia, actually, this is probably it's a question about culture in general. Asking you particularly as a German person and the US, do you ever feel sitting between two cultures, which we talk about a lot? Being in the middle of two cultures, being stretched by two cultures. That's one comment from Cornelia. And some great movie suggestions from Alan. And as Christian says, anything else? Silke wants to know the potential landmines. Obviously, that's always good to know where they are, and the regionality. I mean, Sue Shinomiya said it earlier, and Mark Shaw said it just now again, very regional. We'll talk about that, the regionality. It's very important in this country to understand what part of the country you're doing business in and how that affects those interactions, definitely. And then, and people have difficulty sharing. This is from Taka. People have difficulty to share information within the team and collaborate. So, and Sue again says US people don't understand how they come across to other cultures, which is something we can talk about.
All right. Sure. Well, to address the first question by Cornelia, who I happen to know where she's from and where she's living. Yes, I do not feel that I'm sitting between two chairs. I don't feel like I'm in an empty space without support. I think I'm solidly planted in my seat, and my seat isn't. I'm not U.S. American. I'm born and raised German. That does not mean that all my behaviors are still stereotypically or generalized German. So I think I have been stretched during the course of my life due to the experiences I've had with interacting with people who are different. So I don't feel myself wedged in between two cultures. I feel like I have the privilege of having my mind expanded and stretched, which gives me greater flexibility and ease in transitioning between behavioral differences. How about you, Brett?
Yeah, and I've just Cornelia just clarified that I didn't get it right, which is great because I love making mistakes. It's what I learned from. And she says she compares it with her own situation being a German in Austria, which is really difficult.
Yes.
It says that's really difficult. So yeah,
I can resonate with that. Yeah, to address this, yes, it's not always easy to be an outsider in not belonging to the in group, so to say, in cultural talk. However, I feel like I belong. I have found the people that allowed me to be part of their tribe. And that is not the entire country, and it's never been the entire country in my native land. So I feel like I belong. I know that I am an outsider, and I know that I take different positions on certain things. However, and Alan, of course, asked what creates the belonging, because if you don't know this, check out Alan Hedblum's TV program, Feel Like You Belong. What creates belonging is feeling understood, feeling heard, feeling that I am allowed to participate, and feeling like I belong. For me, this past weekend, to give you an example, feeling like I belong means that my African American neighbor from across the street wanted to sit down with me on my front porch and have an adult beverage and just talk. That to me is belonging. All right. So we've had some comments leading or urging me to speed it up here a little bit. All right, then let's get to it. So you will post your challenges in here, and we will address them as we go along. Here's a quick reminder that culture hides more than it reveals, as Brett said earlier. And then there are these parts that we can notice with our sensory receptors. We have 5 senses. We can see, we can hear, we can touch, we can taste, we can smell. So that's what's floating above the water surface. So we can form an image, or we can form a general idea of what we notice about another culture. The challenge lies in recognizing what's underneath the water surface. What is not noticeable are the belief systems, the values, how people form thoughts, how they feel about certain things, what is implicitly learned and traditionally handed down, what is often unconscious to the members of a culture, who if you'd ask them, they couldn't tell you why they behave a certain way. So if you want to look at it that way, what's above the water surface are the do's and don'ts, and what's underneath it is the why, the reasons that float the do's and don'ts above the surface. So let's, as we look at other cultures, let's always remember that there's things we may not be aware of, and that we need to dive into an area that may not be easy to navigate, because there is powerful muscular jaws and pointy teeth that might shred you to pieces. So be careful as you explore, yet do explore, because this animal isn't just its nostrils and its eyeballs. So let's look at what formed this country. And I would not be doing you any service if my history buffness wouldn't shine up here. I majored in history, and this is something that I'm truly passionate about, because without understanding the history of something, you will not make sense of its present, and you won't be able to help shape its future. So let's look at some of the core foundational pieces here. I'm not going to give you a history lecture on this, but you do want to know that aside from tens of thousands of years of native inhabitation in the United States or in the Americas, excuse me, and aside from other European connections or contacts that had been established during the Viking era in the 9th and 10th century, the narrative of the European and North American historians is that Europe discovered America. Christopher Columbus discovered America. The people who lived in the Americas were surprised to be discovered, because they knew they existed and had existed for generations, and thought, okay, welcome, you're here. A couple of hundred years later, in the early 1600s, Europe makes business and gets serious about its discovery and begins settling in North America. The Jamestown settlement in Virginia, in the state of Virginia, is arguably the first permanent English settlement in 16, I believe, 07. And then we have the Mayflower that, beginning in the late 16 teens and early 1620s, began bringing more settlers in to the East Coast in the early half of the 17th century. So this is the founding myth of the country, of the nation. Early settlement, European immigrants, establishing themselves against all odds. The Thanksgiving myth is based in that time when European settlers had a hard time managing the cold winters, and the natives, the friendly natives, came to help them, and Thanksgiving became a national holiday in order to give thanks to all of us, to all our neighbors who help each other out in a time of distress, and we give thanks to what we can reap from the earth. That is a mythological foundational narrative of U.S. culture. Most nations have a founding myth, a narrative. Think of the Roman Empire with Romulus and Remus sucking on the teeth of the wolverine, or Germany's founding myth of Arminius Hermann the German defeating the Roman Empire in Teutoburg Forest. Many nations have that narrative, and in the United States, this is the narrative that is the foundational cornerstone: Jamestown settlement and Mayflower. Then we're from that, we have 13 founding colonies that eventually in 1776 declare independence. So if you ever ask yourselves, what are these red and white stripes on the US flags? I get the 50 stars for the 50 states, but what's up with the stripes? These are 13 stripes, resembling the 13 founding colonies who wrangled independence from the royal house in England. And finally, or not finally, but another stepping stone along that line of becoming a more mature nation is the Civil War in the from 1861 to 65, which saw a tremendous military violent conflict between the people of a newly formed country, brothers and sisters, families fighting with each other over various reasons. However, please make no mistake, and you can challenge me all day long. I'll find the history piece for you to prove it. The reason for the Civil War, the starting spark that caused the fire, was the issue of slavery. In the state of South Carolina, in Fort Sumter, that's where it began. South Carolina declared secession from the United States because they wanted to keep their slaves, which was something that the northern states wanted to change. And there are many other issues that bled into this war, but the underlying reason for this conflict was the issue of slavery, the fact that slavery went against the foundational document of the country, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which says all men are created equal and are equipped with the same rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that was a cognitive dissonance the country was born with, that how can one human being own another human being? How can we have equal rights for every human, and have slavery? So this is the kind of the birth defect of a nation, which was tried to be rectified in a civil war, and the Civil War ended slavery. It didn't end the issue of injustice and inequality. And we could have a day-long webinar around that topic. Maybe we could have a year-long webinar around that topic. What I do want to point out, though, is that this was to this day has been the most painful conflict the United States have been in. No other war that the United States participated in saw more casualties. 670,000 people died or so during the Civil War, during those 4.5 years. That is more than all the other wars combined that the U.S. took part in, more than the casualties of all the other wars combined. So we see a trend here, and I don't want to overemphasize this, but this is something that I think should be understood as you look at US culture. From the very get-go of how the country was shaped, there was always a certain degree of violence. There was always a certain degree of overpowering others. So the European settlers overpowered the native population that was there before. There was a war of independence that overpowered the English. And then there was war over the question of slavery. So violence, to a certain degree, is part of the fabric of US culture. And whether we like it or not, it has been there. And it has been, somebody, I don't know who said it first, I read it somewhere not too long ago, that the United States still somewhat lives in this frontier spirit of having to conquer the land and being ready to go into battle for whatever that may be. And it is manifested in the constitution of the country. After the constitution was established in the late 1700s, quickly thereafter was the Bill of Rights that added on to the constitution with the first 10 amendments. And the First Amendment grants people the freedom of speech, and the Second Amendment grants people the freedom to bear arms and to form, I think, an organized militia. And I think it's important to understand this. And I had to come to terms with this as an outsider looking in. And I don't know how many people ask me this during cultural trainings. How is it possible? How is the Second Amendment still relevant? And how is it still informing people's decision in this country today? And I don't have an answer, a blanket answer for this. However, I do want to remind you that when people came from Europe to look for a safe haven, to look for a new country, to look for a new land that promised them what they couldn't get in their native lands, they took huge risks by going over the Atlantic Ocean in those little dingy wooden boats. They took huge risk. They risked everything. They risked their lives. They left everything behind in the country that they came from for the promise of a better life, if they came voluntarily. I'm not willfully excluding the people that were brought here against their will. I'm talking about the people who came here voluntarily. They left behind so much. And why would people do that? Why would people take that huge risk? Because they felt some level of oppression. They felt some level of threat or some level of disregard or disenfranchisement or disadvantagement in their native lands. And mainly because they experienced government overreach, mainly in mostly monarchical structures or dictatorial structures, that they engraved that in their constitution, that no, you're not taking our guns away from us, because we need to be able to defend ourselves against the overreach of our government. Even though we might give ourselves our government, we've learned or we've experienced in the lands that we came from that government isn't always to be trusted. So therefore, it is galvanized in the country's foundational document. Whether we like that today or whether we don't like today, that's irrelevant. If you're doing business with the US, you need to understand the why, what's underneath the water surface. Brett, do we have any comments or questions around this? I saw someone raising their hand.
Oh, I didn't see the raising your hand, but yes.
If you have a question, please put it in the chat box. When you raise your hand, that's awesome. That we know that you're there and participating. If you have a question, please use the chat box. That makes us that it's easiest for us to see. Yeah. So I think I needed to address this portion of U.S. culture, that there is traditionally in the history of this country, there's always been a certain degree of power grab or power utilization, and those who are stronger win. And it's something that has become part of the fabric of U.S. culture, is a winning, liking to win culture, right, Brett?
Yeah, absolutely. Scorekeeping, that's why the various sports are popular here, and other sports are popular in other countries, where scorekeeping here is very important, and the winning aspect of actually having a result at the end of it. Unlike my favorite sport of cricket, of course, where it can go for 5 days and end in a draw 50% of the time.
Right.
Absolutely blows the mind of an of
Or
the US
soccer.
American players. Or soccer, yeah. Soccer can go 90 minutes and we can have a draw and everybody walks off the pitch and shakes hands, yes.
Right. All right. So we promised you we'll have some tools to dive into this or understand the structure behind culture and what the general dynamics are. One of these tools that Brett and I like to use quite a bit is called GlobeSmart. Well, I'm going to let you explain that, Brett. So we're comparing 6 different nation cultures here. What do people get when they use GlobeSmart? What's behind that?
Yeah, on the surface, you get a very a good dynamically produced result of a nation's general culture. But when you do your own cultural profile, which is driven out of 40 questions that you answer, it pinpoints you across these 5 dimensions. These are not absolutes. These are a continuum. There is no right or wrong. And yes, we've got 6 nations up here. We've plotted across this graph. You can see, won't read out these, but we encourage you to go to globesmart.com and have a look at that. You can do your own free profile. But a lot of the work that we base on when we work with people, we use this as a conversation starter to say, where might you possibly have differences or things in common with the host culture you're going to or interacting with. And also to explain a little bit why you might be different to what your national culture indicates, which is very important also to do, to put a wrap around it. So as we go forward, just keep in mind that we use this as a tool, a training tool and a coaching tool for people when we're talking about culture.
Right. So we're not going to debrief those 5 dimensions here for you. Many of you are either familiar with cultural comparison frameworks because you work in a similar field as Brett and I do. And those of you who would like to take a deeper dive, as Brett said, go to globesmart.com and reach out to us after this. We'll show you towards the end of this webinar how we can do this in a deeper way, in a more in-depth way. An additional tool that I would like only to highlight is the work by Erin Meyer that some of you might be familiar with. She is the author of the Culture Map. She's using a lot of her mapping based on frameworks like GlobeSmart, so it's not necessarily something new she invented. She's just rearranging the data and the information that we've had scientifically for several decades now. And here she's overlaying two dimensions, how emotionally expressive a culture tends to communicate, or how emotionally restrained a culture, as you see that in the vertical axis, and then you see in the horizontal axis whether that conversation or that communication is confrontational or non-confrontational. And you see the US plotted here against many other nation cultures, and you might recognize your own nation culture on this grid. And we can have a conversation around whether you agree with the plotting or not. These tools help us visualize certain behavioral differences, and these are usually the starting point for a conversation and not the final answer. Nadia is asking if we can elaborate task versus relationship, please. So let me go back to that GlobeSmart slide. Brett, how would you elaborate quickly on the task versus relationship dimension?
Certainly. So because it's a continuum and there's no right or wrong, there's just right and left. So a culture that might be more task orientated are those that get to the point very quickly in terms of focusing on the job that is at hand without necessarily taking the time and they may have people around them that they're doing that task with, but they're really focused on getting the tasks done. Other cultures take more time and probably are driven by the goal of getting to know the people they're going to do that task with first. Mm-hmm. So they understand that the task cannot be achieved unless you get to know the people that you're working with. And therefore that's driven by a more relationship style of thinking. Brazilians are like this. Brazilians would be, you fundamentally have to be a friend of a Brazilian person to work with them effectively. Here in the US, perhaps not. It are people that can be very siloed and say, maybe I don't have to sit down and have a beer with this person I'm working with, but that doesn't matter. If they're good at their job, I'm happy to work with them, and they're effective at it, I'm happy with that. So that's kind of one. That's a good question. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Brett, and thanks for that question, Nadia. Another dimension, or another two dimensions that are outlined in the culture map is, how do we lead? How do we interact? Is it egalitarian, meaning do we have fairly flat hierarchies, equal access to power, or is it more hierarchical with a layered, structured distribution of power? So that's the horizontal axis here, and you see the vertical axis. Do we lead in a top-down instructional manner, or do we build consensus first? So you see here the U.S. Evenly plotted in this top left. That's left, right? Yeah, top left quadrant. So quite egalitarian, quite low, flat hierarchies, not completely flat, not like Denmark or the Netherlands, but it's fairly flat, and also quite top down, quite instructional and quite decisive, compared to the leadership styles in several other countries that you see plotted here. So these are the tools that we work with, and I want to reiterate, these are not the be-all, end-all answers. These are usually the starting points of a conversation in a training, and they can be helpful. However, there's always the disclosure that there is no such thing as a homogeneously uniform culture. There might be a few in the world, maybe Japan, Korea might qualify for that classification, and yet I will let Japanese and Korean people give me the answer on that. But most cultures that I've interacted with through the course of my career are not homogeneous, and we will take a look now at how the US is not homogeneous and split up into different segments. So first, before we do that, I do want to address, again, the foundational narrative of the country. Remember Jamestown, Mayflower, and then there is this self-image that many people in the United States have of the country being a melting pot. And the idea is that no matter where people came from, they came to this country and became something new. They were all melted into this new idea. It says so on the national crest. Here's a coin, a US coin, where it says "E pluribus unum." That is Latin, and it means from many, one. So the idea is, the self-image is that no matter where you came from, and whether you came here on your own volition or you were brought here against your will, essentially now you're here and you form something new. That is the idea of a nation. That is an idea of a nation that is not like its European predecessors, quote unquote, formed on tribal cohesion, on linguistic uniformity, on one shared narrative. It's no matter where you come from, as long as you adhere to the book, which is the Constitution, our rules. If you identify with the values that we give ourselves, then you become one of us. That's the melting pot narrative, the melting pot idea. The reality, however, is that the US are not really a melting pot. If you put everything in a melting pot and melted it down, you would get one brownish homogeneous mass, which the US is not. So if you've ever come to the United States, you will see that it is very diverse, very different, and it looks different from coast to coast and from state to state. So some people like the salad bowl metaphor better, with every individual ingredient remaining its integrity and its individual unique taste, and together it creates this beautiful new taste of the salad. That is one way of looking at it. Others use the mosaic metaphor, hence this image of the US flag as a mosaic, where every individual piece is unique and contributes to a bigger, more beautiful picture. So it's not that we're there yet. The US isn't a finished product. It's an ongoing experiment. It is aspirational excellence, so to say. Brett, you had a great phrase to describe that before we came on the call. And I don't think we can hear you. There's something wrong with your audio. So I'll just keep talking. That's perfectly fine. So aspirational goals, the aspiration of becoming a more perfect union. So the US is not a finished product. The US is a country that is still in development, and we're seeing it playing out right now, sometimes on the streets, sometimes in media and social media discourse over what's going on in this country right now. It's an unfinished country, and it's an experiment that continues. However, most of the people who are part of this country feel an obligation to contribute to the betterment. So yes, a pluribus unum, from many one, and yet the oneness remains to be completed, and who knows if it ever will. There have been many studies out how the US are separated into different tribes or different nations, as this one study from several years ago is claiming. I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty details of this map. It will show you that this study was looking at how people in the United States migrate, how they move to certain pockets, subcultural pockets of the country, where they feel kinship, where they feel they belong better. It also follows a certain color scheme. You see the red portions of this map are representative of areas of the country that vote predominantly conservative, and in this case in the United States would be the Republican Party. And then you also see the blue portions on this map. These are areas in the country that traditionally voted more liberal or left-leaning Democratic. And keep in mind, this map or this study was before the 2016 general election, where a lot of the trends have changed. A lot of the traditional voting patterns were changed, and this is one way of explaining it. Another map that I found is not taking a political look. It's taking a more regional look about how culture or how subcultures can be plotted in the great map of the United States. You see, I don't know how many do we have here, in 36 different regions, right? So while my friend Brett here is in the region number 9, which would be the Great Lakes area, I think Chicago is still in the Great Lakes subcultural corner. I am in the 15 reddish pocket of the country, the Deep South, and find yourself if you live in the United States. Brett, you wanted to say something about the aspirational nature of the country.
Yeah, I just the profile brings or plots the US as egalitarian, and there's a lot of people that a lot of my clients have come here, they've had some experience here, and they kind of question it, and they say, well, you know, we understand that the US culture wants to treat everybody the same, but does it actually lie in reality? And I kind of term it aspirational egalitarianism. There's a story that a culture can tell itself and say, this is how we want to perceive ourselves or put ourselves out there to the rest of the world. But the underlying reality is not doesn't play out in that way. So, and that does have ramifications for clients that we're working with that are people of color and people of different diverse backgrounds and views. So, and of course, this regionality is important, that we know where they are actually going to be hosted, because unless we know this and can speak to some of it, just assuming everybody's the same here in the US would be really worthless for us to do in our work.
Right. So no matter what your point of contact is with the United States, please make sure that you educate yourself about the regionality, about the regional differences, about the subcultural context in which you're doing business, because selling a product, a service, a widget in the Bay Area of California is not the same as selling your product in the upper Midwest or in the Deep South. You want to be conscious of the regional characteristics of these subcultures. Here are a few data slides that I think might be interesting for those of you who don't live here. This is a map of the population density. The darker the blue, the more dense the population. So you see, yes, a big country, but not evenly, people are not evenly distributed over it. This relief map may give you a little bit of a better view or a more detailed view. The higher the peaks, the higher the population density. So that may may give you some pause, or maybe may think you a little bit differently about the country. Also, the ethnic diversity, this is based on data from the 2000 census. So we'll have a census this year that may provide us with new data, maybe better data. We'll see. And you will see on this map, you at least see from at least 20 years ago, where people place their ancestry in the United States, where they claim they came from, or their ancestors came from, and that will explain a lot about the behavioral differences in certain pockets of the country. If you live in a pocket that has a lot of Mexican or Spanish ancestry, the behavioral trends will be different than in an area where there's more Scandinavian or German immigration, or British, Irish, Italian immigration. So all of this matters. So this also manifests in how people talk. This is an incomplete map of linguistic diversity in the United States. There is, I'll hope I find it. In my email to you, you'll get a link to an article that explains the different subcultures and highlights some of those, so to give you a little bit more context. And I hope I find the link to the New York Times quiz. So don't shoot the messenger. It doesn't matter what medium it was published. It was a scientific study where you're asked how you pronounce certain words, or what concepts you have around certain languages and how you pronounce it in English. And then it will plot you on the map of the United States. It's a fun experiment. It'll show you the linguistic, or the accent diversity of this country. So people don't speak a uniform language. And for many people in the United States, English isn't always their first language. Here, raising my hand. Yes, I do speak it fluently. However, it's not my first language, and that's not just my story. There's a lot of people in this country whose first language is not English, or who at least speak a second language in their family, in their home, in their extended circles. And that informs how people express their thoughts, feelings, and how they behave with each other. Brett.
Henry asked very early on about this, and I wanted to pick up on it about the accents. He said, I don't have an accent, you do, which is something I say sarcastically all the time to people, because my accent, I'm very lucky, I'm very privileged. Not only am I white and I'm middle-aged and man, I've also got an accent to it, and the American ear is very exotic, and they love it, and they go, wow, you where are you from? I love your accent. And of course I get pushed back and say, well, I don't have an accent. You're the one that's got the accent. I sound completely fine to me. So it is important that, and some of that leads because they can't really understand what I'm saying, especially if I'm riffing in a very fast way, or using particular vernacular. But of course, my wife is Polish, and she's spoken 5 or 6 languages in her life, and now my daughter speaks 2 languages fluently. And so there are different accents flying around our house all the time. So we're very lucky that our ears are tuned to accents, and a lot of European very finely tuned to accents. And people come here and they find, oh, there are people that sound different in this country. I've been mistaken for being from Boston because I say car park.
I've been mistaken for being from Russia because apparently,
right.
I do want to address a few questions here. April Yakub, I hope I pronounced your name right. April Yakub says, I'm surprised you don't have the percentage of Asians. I'm surprised myself. Let's look at the slide again. Maybe it was not collected during that. Well, it says here, other, the white box here, other Chinese are I guess packed into that. Please don't shoot the messenger. This is data that was collected by the U.S. government in the 2000 census. So we didn't make up the map. It was data that we found online that's freely available. I have another question here in the Q&A box. Could you further clarify the difference between top-down and hierarchical? Well, top-down and hierarchical is that's a good question. Let me go back to that slide real quick. I don't want too much, man, but I think it's important to address this real quick. So you can be hierarchical and still be consensual, as you see in cultures like Germany or Japan, where there's a clear difference of power, who is in charge and who has the authority to essentially make decisions. However, even in hierarchical and consensual cultures, a leader or a cascade of leadership will rarely make unilateral decisions without building consensus among the team. So you find that in cultures like Japan or Germany, or in this case Belgium here, and you can be top down and hierarchical and being more authoritarian and still have that same difference of power distribution like you have in many Latino cultures or in Eastern European cultures, where it's not only clear who has the power and authority, they also take decisions decisively without necessarily building a consensus. So that is the difference of that dimension. I hope that answers that, Adriana. And Usama Zabir asks, how big is the difference between national and regional cultures of the United States? Which one dominates the other for US people working in other countries? That's a great question. What's bigger, national or regional cultural differences? Brett, how would you answer that?
I would argue, and I'm not an expert on this, but I would argue that the regional cultures do play a large part, because I've worked with people that are going off to work in other cultures or other countries that if I'm working with them here in Chicago, they may be from the Northeast, and they absolutely speak to the discomfort, the culture shock that they experienced when coming and working in the Midwest. And sometimes I'm talking about, okay, so let's draw on that culture that you're from, that very direct, very task-orientated culture that you experience up in there in the Northeast. And if you can draw on that, maybe the country you're going to, you're going to have to kind of relive that. You're going to have to use that dominant culture you've got. So it's very situational, as all of this. It's very messy work. But it's a great question. I think that's a really wonderful observation.
And I live here in the United States South, and I've lived here for 16 years in the Southeast. Very distinct linguistic region, very, very distinctly distinct subculture. I've lived in Appalachia, in Southern Appalachia for quite a while. That is completely different than going to Boston, to New York, to Chicago, or to the big coastal cities, or even completely different than the upper Midwest or the Pacific Northwest. It's a very unique region, and I learned that quickly, and I had to adjust accordingly. So I behave and act differently around people in the rural South than I would around people from New York or Boston. We have a raised hand. If you did raise your hand, you will remember it. And I would ask you to put your question in the chat box. That makes it easier for us to reply. Thank you. And we're past the hour and we're not done yet. So this is what I expected would happen. So we'll continue. And those of you who have to move on, thanks for lasting that long. Those of you who want to join us for the ride, we're getting close to the finish line, then we're happy you're still here. So we're going to look at some of the cultural phenomena or some of the cultural values that Brett and I thought would be most relevant to shine a light on. There's more than these, but I think these are the ones that matter most as you do business with the United States. Please know that Americans tend to give, I'm not saying all of them, many US Americans give trust easily. They also revoke trust quickly if they don't see it adding value to them anymore. And they also trust themselves most. It's a country of bootstrapping, of getting it done yourself. So relying on yourself is one of the key values in this country. Help yourself before you ask somebody else for help. This is based in the foundational belief system of many of the European immigrants who came with a strong religious belief system of self-determination. And if you help yourself, then God will reward that. There's a religious component to that. So self-reliance is deeply built into the US American DNA. Secondly, a strong sense of individualism. Brett, how would you describe that?
Yeah, in the profile, my country, for example, is quite close to the US when they talk about individualism. But I kind of do put a disclaimer on that and say there is and it's driven by historical things that we won't get into here. But there is maybe a sense of very independent, personal independence here in this country, where yes, independently you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You are your own. The best place to find a helping hand is at the end of your own arm. Historically in Australia, yes, we're very skeptical of authority and outside authority, but our country is built on an individual, but I would argue a collective individualism, a sense of a collective of the culture and the country itself as individual from the authority of the Crown, which we still actually are under the auspice of, but we're we express that in a very individual way as a society. Right. So that can be a different, if that explains that a little bit.
It does, and the best way to find a helping hand is at the end of your arm, or the squeaky wheel gets the grease, which is one of those old phrases that has been introduced to me as I came to this country. Only if you speak up, if you make a sound, will you get attention. Only if you make yourself seen and heard and known will people tend to your needs. If you're going to be a wallflower, then you will likely not be successful. So if you come from a culture where belonging to a group and being part of a group and not sticking your head out is the preferred way of interacting, then that may be a challenge for you in the United States. So my encouragement to you is you can work with us. We'll help you widen your comfort zone a little bit, or we'll show you how you can be okay with the discomfort of sticking your neck out a little bit. Both Brett and I come from cultures where that behavior isn't necessarily rewarded. So both he and I had to learn to be that person. I mean, the fact that I'm putting my face on this platform and talking about this is putting my neck out, and there's something that I had to become comfortable with, right? So that is the nature. That is I would say at the core, among the core elements of U.S. culture, and what Brett said earlier, the winning quickly, the driven to success, let's just see who gets the upper hand. Brett, does that sometimes take a nasty turn, the winning most, the zero-sum game?
I think, well, it may be perceived as aggressive. There's the word the words are used by when we ask about perceptions of people that we're working with that are coming here, or I do anyway. They talk about aggressiveness, but not really. They kind of understand it's not coming from a negative place, but there is an aggressiveness, and it speaks to the squeaky wheel gets the grease. The same thing. So it is, yes, it is this scorekeeping of the application of scorekeeping in this culture, where things are scored and there are records kept and there's data kept just to measure things and do that kind of thing in this culture, which is a little bit more nuanced in other cultures, where we have people get more just of a general sense of how things are going and they make their decisions from that. Here in the US, it can be very explicit. It's good in one way because a lot of my clients say, well, at least we kind of know what we're getting. Now that obviously works in some regions, may not work in Minneapolis or something like where where it's a little bit more high context. But I think that's a big part of it. Yeah.
There's a comment on right on that, and I think that's important to address. This Sebastian Meyer Hallard. I'm not quite sure if I'm pronouncing Sebastian's name right. He said we mentioned the win mentality, and isn't that rather a mentality driven by European descendants rather than from other ethnicities in the U.S.? There's a point to that. I think predominantly the winner takes all mentality is something that was brought over mainly by white or predominantly white European settlers. However, it is a phenomenon, I think, that transitioned or translated into the different subcultural groups of the country. They may be less zero-sum game winning most within their own demographic. However, as subcultures in the US interact with other subcultures in the US, there's always, in my experience, the desire, hey, I want to have the upper end. I want to benefit from it. Or as they say, the most popular radio station in the United States is WIIFM. What's in it for me? That often drives the decision making or the contemplation whether do we want to do business with each other or not. What's in it for me? What can I gain from this? This is this is often a driver, an entrepreneurial driver, not so much a group-oriented driver. It's more of a, what can I gain from this? And if I gain from it, I can give to my kin or I can give to my tribe, but I want to gain first, and then I decide how much I give. And this is something that is also represented in how the individual relates to the body of society. In many European societies, there is an understanding that we teeth-grindingly, reluctantly give a big portion of our paycheck to the government, and that we get something in return from the government, so that there's a contract between the individual and society as a whole, that we have more of a responsibility by the abstract body of society or government in that case. In the United States, it's almost the exact opposite. It's you look out for yourself, and if you do well, if you're successful, if you're rewarded with success by your entrepreneurialism and your individualism and your self-actualization, if you're successful, then it is your obligation to share your success with those who helped you get there or who you think should benefit from it. However, you have a choice whether you want to share that with the entirety of society or only with a pocket of society, right? So that's a different type of approaching it. Keeping score. Also, motivation by short-term gain rather than long-term goal setting. Now, this is something that I've been seeing. Brett, how did you experience this?
Yes, it's definitely the quick satisfaction aspect of the culture here. It's something that drives the comfort with debt in this country, that you can gather things and you can, and I guess it's shown up in the current situation with the pandemic, is that, it's discovered that a lot of people may on the surface look very comfortable, but then, when they're doing without the second paycheck, it all of a sudden comes crashing down. Right. And so there are a lot of cultures, people that come from other cultures, that really question that, and they ask, why is that? And I say, well, it is that immediate gratification that comes and has been, from a very prosperous country, and that no doubt has experienced economic downturn, but in the whole, even in that economic downturn, there is still, relative to other cultures, a lot of abundance. So it brings about a lot of very positive, affirmational mindset in this country. Yeah.
Plus, you can see it now with the pandemic. I mean, we have 40 or more million people newly filing for unemployment. So people lost jobs quickly, and it's hurting. The pandemic is hurting those on the bottom of the economic totem pole most. So the inequality is even more pronounced or more shown a light on by the pandemic. And that is leading to a lot of self-reflection in the country. Not everybody in the country is okay with the status quo. So this is not something that is set in stone. We're not saying that the United States, the people in the United States are always in full acceptance of their own cultural phenomena. The U.S. is a young country that is willing to modify that. How much they're willing to modify their ways of doing remains to be seen. We're going through a time of health disruption, of global disruption that leads to economic disruption, and we're currently seeing in the past week social unrest that may lead to change. We don't know that. I'm not the one with a crystal ball here. What I'm saying is, from having lived here for so long and having studied U.S. history, the U.S. is willing to learn from. Is willing to take lessons from what's going on. Whether they were always for the betterment, I'm not the judge of that. But there is the U.S. culture is flexible enough to respond to something quickly, quicker so with a higher risk comfort level than others. And you may have seen a slogan that's been around for 30 plus years. My friends here that live on the Pacific Coast in the Oregon area, they know this particularly well. The just do it, the I can do it, the can-do spirit, the it is possible, the turning it upside down, not accepting defeat, not laughing in the face of the obstacle, and this is something that has built this country. the willingness to take risk and smiling in the face of adversity and doing it anyway. So you can say a lot of these cultural phenomena that we addressed here in the last couple of minutes may be seen as critical or sometimes questionable. However, a lot of the success of the United States in the last 200 plus years is, yes, based on slave labor. I'm not going to negate that, and it is also based on a willingness to experiment and to explore and to just do it, right? It is the mindset of tomorrow will be a better day. And I personally come from a culture where people would see the right glass of these two. They would look at the half empty glass, and you can obviously look at it as half full. You could be a scientific person and say, well, technically it is, both glasses are full with water and air. And an American marketing person will say, let's explore the benefit of ice cubes here. So looking at a situation from a more future positive angle, that is also the very nature of the United States. And you saw it last week. It may have not made your news cycle. It may have not been at the forefront of your perception of the country amid all the unrest and difficulties with the pandemic. This country is still innovative. It's still following people's dreams and imaginations, and it's being ingenuous. I hope I say that word right. So we saw the launch of SpaceX, a company founded by an immigrant, right? So power to the country, or ingenuity for the United States, designed, developed, and pushed forward by somebody who was not born here and found success here. So this is just for me, the most recent symbol of how the US is still an attractive country, is a culture that is worth engaging with. To answer Patricia Coleman's question in the Q&A box, what would you say to someone wanting to move to the US in these challenging times? Is it still a land of opportunity? Well, I think this picture should be an answer to that. Yes, the country has its challenges. It's an imperfect union, and it's working on it, right? And it's a country where they sometimes don't value the thinker as much. And I am from a culture of thinkers, right? Germans are known to be overthinkers sometimes. And I've chosen to live in a country of doers, of decisive action takers. And to answer the question that was asked earlier, do I sometimes feel myself between those two chairs? Maybe I feel myself between those two statues. Sometimes I feel like I need to sit down and think a little harder before I start doing. And then I see my environment just doing it. And that is something that I continue to learn. How about you, Brett?
Yeah, absolutely. I do. It's one thing I always say. I'm always positive. I'm a glass half full kind of guy. It's a very Aussie thing to be very optimistic. But I also do say seriously, this is a country I enjoy living here. For all its warts, just like every country, I have a choice to live anywhere in this world, but I choose to live here, and my family are here. We're all immigrants in this family, and that's brought challenges. But of course, I think it is a place that you should engage with. The opportunities here are great, and but they also come with some landmines, as we said before. So it's and I think that to address something that was I was going to say something else, but it's gone completely out of my mind, which is typical for me.
It's our age, Brett. We're getting too old for this.
I got wrapped up in the SpaceX thing. I think it is really in the midst of so much worry and strife and conflict, that out of that a little rocket can spurt from the surly bonds of Earth, right? And
right.
And two human beings leave this planet and go and fly around it. It's amazing. And I made sure I made my daughter watch it, or she was already going to watch it. She was fascinated by it. She's fascinated by that kind of stuff. But I just encourage everybody that this is a challenge worth taking. I also want to also bring up the point that the reverse is just as important, as I always say. We've talked a lot about when people come here, how they've got to kind of realize what's taking place in this country and how to do business, but also the US Americans here, is important that they understand the culture from where people come from. So that they understand that some people, I think someone mentioned before that, I think it was Jill, mentioned that obviously if you're not as forceful, if you're not as vocal, then it does sometimes come off as less confident. And yet people come from this country, from cultures where they're probably the smartest people in the room, but they don't have that faculty. They're not tasked with that faculty to be able to express it in that way. So that's part of our teaching. It's part of what when we really dig into the depths of this work, how we kind of give the actual tools and the skills to do that. It's great work.
We plan on doing that, and this is how we would like to wrap this up. We're 20 minutes over, and there are still 59 of you there. So I really appreciate you being patient with us.
Very grateful. Yeah, yes, very grateful for everyone that stayed. And the conversation's been great. So we're going to be saving that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, we're saving that, and we're saving some of the questions that remain unanswered during the time we have here, because we knew this was going to happen, and we're offering to take this in depth. So if you or somebody that you know, or maybe someone in your organization, or somebody in your circle of influence that would benefit from having a more deep dive around this topic of US culture and how to be successful in dealing with it, Brett and I will be offering a live training. We will host it on this platform. It will be not a recorded thing. It will be 2 hours times 2 on 2 separate days, on June 29th and on July 1st. And it will be for your eyes only. And we'll put you to work, and we'll put you through our exercise, and we'll have some fun with us. And we'll take this deeper. It'll be the extension of what you saw here today. And you're ready to sign up, say yes. And if you are still contemplating it, let us know in the follow-up email that you get from us. You can respond to that. We'll make sure you have a way to engage with us. We'll take you deeper, and to stay with us and to follow us, what we do, and to be members of our tribe. Here's how you do that. This is how Brett and I would like to be with you. Thank you for spending time with us today. Brett, final thoughts?
Well, onward and upward. Yeah, thanks to everybody that that attended, and of course, not adding in a pithy way, but obviously we wish everybody safety and wellness during this time. And we just want to encourage you to learn culture, learn more, question yourself, question us, question the people around you, reach out to people and engage with them. You never know what you'll learn.
Exactly. I can't say it any better. That's why I shut up. I'm stopping the share. I'm stopping the recording. You will get a copy of the recording